Welcome everyone to today's food safety webinar, Post-Harvest Handling. This webinar will discuss and identify potential routes of contamination in harvest and post-harvest settings, including harvest, washing, storage, packing, cooling, and transportation. We will discuss key parts of pest control programs and key principles associated with cleaning and transporting produce, as well as corrective actions that can be taken to reduce risk and key record-keeping requirements. This webinar is part of a series of food safety webinars coordinated and conducted by the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative to help Native American farmers, ranchers, and food producers understand the importance of food safety and what is necessary to reach compliance under the Food Safety Modernization Act. Attendees will learn about produce safety, foodborne pathogens, worker health, wildlife, land use, post-harvest handling, and legal issues associated with food safety in Indian country. This series is part of a twofold effort to reach producers and food businesses. The IFAI has also launched a series of in-person food safety trainings in regional locations. I encourage you to visit our website at indigenousfoodandag.com/foodsafety for a listing of these trainings and information about how to register. The in-person training events will result in the award of a certificate. The webinars we are hosting will help you better understand these issues and will help prepare you to participate more deeply in the regional training events. We will not award a certificate for the webinar trainings. We're merely trying to broaden knowledge of the important principles that will be covered in the regional training events. If you look at the handout section of your control panel, you'll find the slideshow being presented today. I invite you to visit our website at indigenousfoodandag.com/foodsafety, where you'll find more information about our food safety trainings, downloadable copies of the presentations, and archived videos of the completed webinars. The issues we will cover in business practices, microbiology, and legal issues are additional information our experts think is important to have access to as a grower. All attendees will be muted during the presentation. Today's presenter, Dr. Rodney Holcomb, will take questions at the end of the presentation. Attendees can use the control panel to submit questions to the presenter. Today's presentation is possible through a 3-year cooperative agreement between the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and the IFAI to provide Native American outreach, training, technical assistance, and education to ensure compliance with the Food Safety Modernization Act. Our work is part of the broad efforts we will undertake to provide outreach, training, technical assistance, and education on food safety issues. Now I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Rodney Holcomb, the Charles B. Browning Endowed Professor of Food Studies with the Food and Agricultural Products Center at Oklahoma State University. Dr. Holcomb is a professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics at Oklahoma State University. His research interests lie in the areas of value-added manufacturing economics and market evaluations. His goals are to identify economically feasible processing alternatives and business structures for adding value to regional agricultural commodities. He is also instructor of 2 agribusiness management courses in which students develop business and marketing plans for Oklahoma companies as their class projects. His programs have received awards from commodity organizations, professional associations, industry groups, the Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service, Oklahoma State University, and the Oklahoma Governor's Office. He has also received the USDA Plow Honor Award for Exceptional Service, the highest award given by the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture. And with that, Rodney, the presentation is yours.
Brian, thank you very much. I'd like to welcome everyone today. Glad that you could join us as we go through this discussion of post-harvest Handling, Post-Harvest Sanitation Procedures. This is part of the FDA Food Safety Modernization Act Produce Safety Rule. So a lot of the things we'll be talking about are requirements by FDA for those applicable fruit and vegetable growers. Now, we're also going to be talking about many factors that you don't think about typically when you're thinking about farm production of fruits and vegetables. However, we are at that point when we're talking post-harvest. We're at the point where a lot of the good agricultural practices and a lot of the processors' good manufacturing practices start blending a little bit. We're going to talk about possible routes of contamination associated with harvest and post-harvest activities. We'll talk about identifying practices that will reduce risks, some steps, especially those related to cleaning and sanitizing food contact surfaces that will help minimize risk, pest management issues, practices for transporting fresh produce, practices to monitor post-harvest activities. We'll discuss a few corrective actions. We'll also talk about where you can find sources of information to develop your own corrective actions, and along with that, key records to document practices, of which there are multiple examples. The biggest part of post-harvest sanitation really comes down to keeping things clean. You really can't say that enough. Through everything related with FSMA Produce Safety Rule, there are 2 3-word phrases that cover it all: wash your hands and write it down. So for cleanliness, everything that we're going to talk about here is a way to make sure that all those good practices you've employed in the field don't end at the field. That when that product leaves the field and ends up in the packing shed or in a storage facility, those same practices are continued. And we're going to talk about specifically things that relate to the parts of the post-harvest activity where something, maybe even someone, touches or comes in contact with the produce. And that can be containers, it can be equipment, it could be your employees, their hands, their clothing, it could be the post-harvest water, it could be any of the facilities, including coolers, and even the transport vehicles. So we'll cover all of those as we go through this. The basic concepts of sanitation come into play here. Really, we're talking about good housekeeping. Can you keep a nice, clean environment for the fruits and vegetables you've just brought in from the field? And that means facilities. It also means your employees or workers in your facilities, so that practices are implemented properly, that everyone is operating in a sanitary manner, that steps are taken to eliminate or at least minimize the risk of pests and any debris that may create a health safety concern for fruits and vegetables. And several times through this presentation, we're going to talk about minimizing standing water, because standing water is optimal breeding ground for several different pathogenic organisms such as listeria. We'll even talk about cleaning and sanitizing and the fact that those are 2 different steps. One is not the same as the other. For worker training, this becomes a very important, because no matter what else you hear or what we discuss or questions and answers we deal with in this presentation, if none of this ever makes it back to the workers on the farm, then we're at a loss here. If they don't know what they should and should not do, then sanitation practices are going to break down. And first and foremost, as is covered in many other aspects of FSMA Produce Safety Rule training, workers must never harvest produce destined for the fresh market that is contaminated with feces. And this is extremely important. If you think of watermelons are a very common example because they're so big. There's a pretty good chance that in a watermelon field, there's going to be some birds that land on top of those melons, and they may leave a little deposit before they fly away. And the first time an employee walks up to you as the farm manager or farm owner and says, "Hey, beautiful melon, it's got a little bit of bird poop on it. What should I do with it?" If you say, "Put it on the trailer," they're never going to ask you again. Everything that has any feces on it is going to end up on the trailer. So it's very important to know that the workers know that they can't harvest produce destined for the fresh market that's contaminated with feces. They also can never harvest or distribute dropped, covered produce. And this is FDA's way of saying there is no 5-second rule. So if you have an apple orchard and you watch a beautiful, perfect apple fall off the tree and hit the ground, you can't pick it up and distribute it. It cannot be sold in the fresh market. That's part of the new rules. And that little symbol you see in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide says that everything we're talking about here ties into one specific part of the Code of Federal Regulations for that. Workers are expected to maintain some general level of health and hygiene practice, clean clothing and footwear. If you're in a food processing facility, you will see employees wearing gloves and hairnets. They will not be wearing jewelry. You won't have a pin in your pocket that could fall into the produce. And in food processing, if workers take a break, they don't take it near where the actual food is. There are break areas. There are going to be hand washing stations by the restrooms, and there are definitely going to be restroom facilities for them to use that are separate from anywhere where the produce may be held, sorted, stored, or distributed. So that's very important. Now, when we talk about what happens in the post-harvest area, nobody is the same. Everything is different, and packing areas are all very different. You have some that are open to the environment. You may just have a roof. They're even the most simplified versions of these facilities are referred to as 4 sticks and a lid, which basically says I have 4 corner posts and some roof covering that keeps me from getting sunburn on the top of my head. But you may still have wind and even rain blowing in from the sides because it may be open all the way around. The other end of the spectrum, you may have some facilities that are pristine, just absolutely beautiful facilities that are enclosed fully, that have great door and window sills. They may be climate controlled interiors, and we've got to consider all those. And so FSMA still applies to all of them. So regardless of whether you have 4 sticks and a lid or an absolutely pristine establishment, we still have certain rules that we have to follow. And it all comes down to reducing those risks. And cleanliness is part of it. If you've got bad produce, are you making sure you're getting it separate from the good produce that you're going to sell in the fresh market? Is the trash being carried out on a regular basis to make sure that you're not attracting pests or creating a health hazard? That your employees have places where they can wash their hands after they go to the restroom, that when they do take a break, because eventually during the day, somebody's going to want to eat something or take a drink. And do they have a place where they can do that, where they're not going to contaminate or in some way the slobber from the last bite of the sandwich they took goes directly from their hand and mouth down onto the fresh produce that you're packing. Pest management, well, it's not always rodents that we're talking about, but we will address that. Standing water is a problem in any facility, once again, because it's just a breeding ground for some pathogenic organisms. And organization is key to everything. Are you keeping things organized? Just like at home, if everything's cluttered, then you know you're dealing with a mess, and it's going to be hard to overcome that mess. When you're assessing those risks in the packing area, what the FSMA rule lays out here is almost identical to what we saw 20 years ago in the meat processing industry when HACCP came into play. And HACCP stands for Hazard Analysis Critical Control Points. And the same process applies here. What FDA is saying is the same thing USDA said for meat processing plants 20 years ago. Take a look at your operation. Map out the flow of the produce as it goes from the field through right at the point where it leaves your farm gate. And in some cases, if you're doing the delivery on your own vehicle, past your farm gate. So map the flow of it and figure out where there might be any kind of problem, where anything could happen, a critical control point, if you will, where something could happen to contaminate that product. How are you going to monitor that control point to make sure that nothing happens? And how are you going to keep records to make sure that nothing happened? And then just in case something does happen, what's your corrective action? And the specific emphasis here is on what FDA refers to as Zone 1, and that is anything that directly makes contact with the fresh fruits or vegetables. And we'll talk about Zone 1 and Zones 2 through 4, but they've divided it up in that way just to kind of say the biggest area of concern for anyone that is raising fresh produce is any aspect of the post-harvest handling process where something or someone touches that produce. So if you look at the zones in a packing house, and here we have a nice picture of some cantaloupes that have just come out of a washing station. They're being delivered to a rotating sorting table on a conveyor belt once they've left the washer. And so the conveyor belt itself, the table surface, all of those make direct contact with the cantaloupe. So they're part of that zone 1. They're the biggest concern. Zones 2 through 4 are the next levels of separation from zone 1. Zone 2 could be the outer surface of the table. It could be the outer surface of the conveyor belt. It doesn't directly come in contact with the produce, but it does directly come in contact with zone 1. So the legs on the table, for example, would be part of zone 2. The floor is zone 3 because it touches zone 2. And once you get to anything outside that could come in and impact that facility or make its way up these zones to zone 1, that's zone 4. So basically, once you get outside of the facility. So those zones are important, but we focus on zone 1 because that's the biggest area. If we're going to have cross-contamination, that's where it's going to occur because something will touch it. I may have all this produce coming in from a field. I may have multiple commodities coming in from multiple fields. And if I have a contamination problem, I've just bottlenecked everything at the packing house. So what could be a small contamination concern in the field now has become a point where everything could be contaminated. So I have to be concerned about that. That could include the harvester storage bins. It could include my workers' hands, their clothing, the conveyor belts. It could be any brushes or rollers in the system that are designed to clean produce or distributing produce through the facility. Anything that touches that produce, that's our concern. And so that's where our initial efforts have to be focused. The sanitation practices that you employ really are going to depend on the facility you have, the equipment that you have, and they may take a variety of forms. Part of it may just be reinforcing worker training, making sure your employees know that when they use the restroom, wash their hands. When they finish eating lunch, don't put on the latex gloves you had right before you ate lunch. Put on a fresh pair. Watch for pests and monitor, make sure that you have a program in place and that it's working to recognize and catch pests as they come into the facility. Cleaning and sanitizing the surfaces, we'll talk about that here in a second, as well as with everything related to equipment. And do you have equipment that can be cleaned and sanitized? Coolers are a big issue. Coolers are often a point of food safety concern with food products. And think of the Bluebell ice cream issue from a couple of years ago. That was all tied back to the coolers that Bluebell used in their plants and the sanitation procedures for those coolers, and even transportation vehicles. We'll save that closer to the end. It's very important at this point to distinguish the difference between cleaning and sanitizing. Cleaning is getting rid of the dirt. Sanitizing is treating that cleaned surface to reduce or eliminate microorganisms. And you cannot sanitize a dirty surface. I'll give you a good example. Saturday morning, I was helping a colleague of mine. He has a ranch north of Stillwater, Oklahoma. So I was out there at his ranch, and I'm convinced he has a cow that goes to every gate and poops right by the gate. So you have no choice but to step in it when you go to open that gate. I stepped in a pile of cow poop. You know, I could have pulled out a can of Lysol and sprayed that entire can on my boot. My boot is still not clean. More importantly, it's not sanitized because that Lysol would have only affected the surface. It wouldn't have affected anything under the surface that was up in the grooves in the traction on the boot. That wouldn't have done me any good, and you definitely wouldn't have wanted me to walk in your house with that boot because it's still not clean and it's not even sanitized. So you have to distinguish between cleaning and sanitizing. Now, there's a 4-step procedure that the FSMA rules call for cleaning and sanitizing. It may require a 5th step, but we'll get to that in just a moment. First step is to get rid of all the obvious dirt and debris that's going to contact the food service. Now, this is definitely something you got to do for zone 1, but you also want to do it for zones 2 and 3 to make sure that there's no dirt anywhere. Okay, so scrub that obvious dirt and debris, get rid of it. Then apply the detergent and scrub that surface to make sure that the detergent is doing its job, getting rid of the dirt. And it may also be a detergent that breaks down biofilm. Now, biofilm is going to be that organic matter that builds up. You see this in a lot of food processing plants, but it can happen in fruit and vegetable post-harvest handling packing house as well, where you run enough products through there and there's just enough film that comes off the product that maybe it ends up being swept or washed into a corner, and it compiles there. And that biofilm, pathogens love biofilm. That's like having an umbrella. So when I spray sanitizer later, if I haven't broken down that biofilm, the pathogens can live and thrive beneath that biofilm. And there have been studies that have been done to show how even in food processing plants, rubber boots, people might use rubber boots, and the biofilm that builds up on the rubber boots, you can stand in a pool of sanitizer to clean those boots, but if you haven't broken down that biofilm, you can still have a pathogenic problem as a result. So you want to make sure that you scrub and clean those surfaces, then rinse with clean water to make sure that you've gotten rid of not only the dirt but also the detergent, and follow that with a sanitizer. And it has to be a sanitizer that's approved for use on food contact surfaces. If there is a step 5, it's going to be the rinsing, because some sanitizers require a rinse step. So basically your sanitizer is active, then you follow it with a rinse that kind of deactivates the sanitizer or removes any residue that may be there. So it just depends on the labeling of that sanitizer, what the manufacturers recommend if you're using that specific sanitizer. Now, here we're going to get into an idyllic world where everything is perfect and everything is just as we hoped it would be. The real world is just like any farm you've ever been on, and that just doesn't happen. So Murphy's Law applies in all cases. Things that can go wrong will go wrong. But FDA lays this out in a best case scenario. Here's what you would have. All your food contact surfaces would be non-toxic and non-absorbent. So ideally, you'd have stainless steel for everything. But as we all know, stainless steel is extremely expensive, so most people are not going to have that. You'd have durable equipment that's able to withstand corrosion. And if you've ever been in any kind of facility, maybe even a commercial kitchen or a restaurant, where they clean the floors with a wash that includes chlorine bleach, you may see how certain pieces of equipment, like the feet of the equipment, or even the metal frame around an exterior door, may start to rust because they're corroded because of the bleach. So in an ideal world, you'd have food contact surfaces that are non-toxic, they're non-absorbent, they can withstand corrosion, they're real easy to be cleaned and sanitized. There would be no creases, no cracks, no welds. Everything would be nice and smooth. And equipment would be the same way. It would be equipment that is specifically designed to do the one thing you want it to do. And it would be where you can easily access it. It's where you can take it apart if you need to work on it. It would be something that you could easily take apart, replace some parts, maintain it, and put it all back together without a problem. Now, that's the perfect world scenario. We know that rarely happens. So most farms, you're going to have some older equipment. You're going to have, excuse me, you're going to have facilities that maybe weren't designed to be the packing house for fruits and vegetables. But you know what? That barn was there, and rather than tear it down and spend the money to build something else, we tried to retrofit it to make it work. So you can still have a sanitation program. You can still have a cleaning standard operating procedure for everything, even if your equipment isn't perfect. So the challenge may be, can you keep that equipment clean enough? And maybe that means you have to add 1 or 2 more cleaning steps during the course of the day or the growing season, from more than you would have under the perfect conditions. And as long as you have those cleaning schedules that can reduce that contamination risk and prevent that biofilm formation, then great. Even wooden surfaces can be used. Just let them air dry after washing. Equipment and tools that cannot be maintained or cleaned properly, maybe you look at the first opportunity when you can afford it, when you have the time to do it, and you replace that equipment, you replace those tools. And later on down the road, if you get the opportunity to have new equipment, to have new facilities, just make sure that they're designed to make it easier for you and cleaner for the produce that's going through that facility. It's just, in the long run, it'll be easier for you if the next facility you design or the next equipment you buy is exactly suited to its purpose. Now, retrofitting equipment. this becomes a big issue. If you think back to the Jensen Farms Colorado cantaloupe issue from a few years ago where so many people got sick and some died, one of the big problems there was retrofitting a potato cleaning piece of equipment to clean these cantaloupes. And that wasn't the only problem, but that was the first step in a myriad of problems that resulted in deaths and sickness for several people. So if you are going to try to retrofit equipment, first thing to do is check with the manufacturer and make sure that you can actually do this. Is that even possible? Then go in and make sure your changes or modifications won't result in an increased risk of contamination. If I'm in a food processing establishment, I'm not going to have carpet ever. I'm not going to have any cloth materials as part of my equipment because that just becomes a breeding ground for microbes. I don't want that. Same could be said for a post-harvest handling facility on the farm. You want to avoid carpet or any cloth-like materials that don't clean well. They're never dry. They just create a problem. So whenever possible, invest in the right piece of equipment. And ideally, if you look at the picture that we have here, it's pointing out the welds and how welds are hard to clean. Ideally, you would have a piece of equipment where maybe that metal was bent at 90 degrees. So I don't have a tight bend in there that creates an opportunity or a crack or a crevice where things can collect, or I won't have welds. And then once again, that goes back to that ideal condition that unfortunately too often we won't have. So a big part of reducing risk in the packing shed is obviously reducing risk before entering the packing shed. Here's an example. We've got a picture here of a bunch of apples in storage bins. Where have those bins been for the better part of a year? Were they sitting outside subject to weather? Were they sitting in the dirt or in the grass where dirt could collect up underneath them or be blown or washed up underneath them, where insects or rodents could make their own living quarters underneath them? You don't really want that. So you want things that are clean before you use them, and you want to minimize harvest bin contact with the soil whenever possible. If you're touching dirt out in the field, you're bringing dirt into the packing shed. And just look at that picture, those stacked bins. If they've been sitting out in the dirt, I've just transferred dirt from the bottom of one packing bin to the apples that are sitting on the top of the one below them. So I want to reduce the risk of contamination, entering the packaging and storing areas. Getting rid of that dirt also means I've got less dirt in my water, which means I don't have to change out my wash water as often. So that becomes very important for me. It makes it easier for me actually in the packing shed if I reduce these risks before entering the packing area. Now, the picture we see in this one, once again, I can imagine a more ideal packing shed area where everything is nice and pretty and enclosed, and the equipment is stainless steel and everything's laid out and in a beautiful order. I can even see a reflection off the floor. It's that clean. Most farms are probably not going to have something this pretty. So packing area maintenance, really, it comes down to the simple things. Not only am I keeping the floors clean, am I keeping my employees' hands clean, but what am I doing to make sure that I'm not creating long-term difficulties for myself? Cracked hoses result in leaks. Leaks mean standing water. Standing water means breeding ground for listeria, for example. Torn rubber door seals or bad seals around windows. That means potential rodent problems or insect problems in my facilities. I don't want that. If I've got dirty conveyor belts or brushes, if I've got rusty equipment, that means as soon as I turn them on, I'm going to spread a cloud of dust, dirt, and rust over everything in that plant. Condensation, just like standing water. If I've got coolers that have bad doors, then I'm going to have ambient temperature air with cooled air, and the result is going to be condensation that's eventually going to become standing water somewhere. And my employees, do they know what they need to do? Do they know if you're going to take a break and eat a sandwich or eat a banana or drink a cup of coffee, you go to the break area to do it? Do they know to wash their hands before they come back from the restroom back into the packing area? So that packing area maintenance is very important. The containers, once again, ideally, all containers would be new. They would be single-use containers. They come in clean. I put clean produce in them. They leave my facility clean and never return. But that's not always the case, and especially you see that in, for example, apple orchards, where I've got those big wooden storage bins that I'm going to use for several years before I replace them. But ideally, if I had these new single-use containers, they would handle my produce and they would be clean coming in. I would store them in a clean, covered area off the floor, not pushed into a corner where rodents or insects may build their own homes back behind the packing materials in a corner, where dirt could collect, where contaminants could be come in contact with my packing materials. I don't want that. I want to make sure that everything is clean, that it's covered, and that I'm not going to have problems later on. Pests, you know, they're called pests for a reason, because that's exactly what they are. And they can come in 100 different ways. A mouse only needs an opening big enough to squeeze a pencil through, and a mouse can enter. And once that mouse is in your packing shed, that mouse is going to feed, and that mouse is going to breed. Same goes for insects and birds. So whenever possible, whenever you see a problem, take care of it. But even in the off season, inspect all the walls, doors, and windows to repair any holes that may be there, seal some cracks, take care of some busted rubber seals around the doors between the floors and walls. And birds. Birds are a huge problem for produce when they're in the field. They're a huge problem, especially in those lower end of the spectrum packing sheds that we were talking about earlier, the 4 sticks and a lid type of packing shed. Birds will look at a facility like that and go, hey, great, I've got cover. Rain's not going to hit me, and I've got a nice place to sleep at night. And if you've ever had a house, a garage, or a barn where birds have entered and kind of taken that over as their home, you know the problem that it can be to get rid of them. And you also know how the poop piles up under the rafters where they roost. So you want to deter them in any way possible, preferably not with cats. And that's a topic for another one of these sessions where we talk about wildlife and domestic animals. You don't want cats in your packing shed. Cats they carry so many different pathogenic organisms and viruses, and you just don't want them. You don't want them in your shed if ever possible. So if you do have an enclosed facility, make sure your doors and windows are closed as much as possible. Don't prop them open and create problems for pests. If you've ever been to a food processing establishment of any kind, you'll notice how clean they keep the area around the facility. The grass is always mowed. There are no shrubs and trees right up against the side of the building, because that's just a holding area for pests, and you don't want that. So you want to keep them out as much as possible. Coal piles and your garbage, take them out every day, and if necessary, multiple times through the day. And especially for things such as birds and insects that may make their way into your packing shed, when you can, keep the produce covered. If you can. It's not always possible, because covering some produce, especially as it comes in from the field, if it's still warm, that may create a condensation problem, and that just results in more problems. But if possible, keep the produce covered. Now, you can put all sorts of traps designed to catch rodents, designed to catch insects, or even birds. One thing you'll notice, though, most facilities that have a good pest management system, the traps are outside the door. They may be by the door where these pests make their way in, or by a window, but the traps are always outside. I don't want to lure them into the facility. I want to catch them before they get into the facility. So think about where would be the most appropriate locations for those traps, and make sure that you check them. In fact, depending on the size, excuse me, depending on the size of your facility, you may even outsource this to a service provider. For example, I work in a food processing facility that's got about 90,000 square foot of food processing space. And we contract with a company called Ecolabs. They set the traps, they do the monitoring, they keep all the records, and we get copies of those records. So we have that. And this is something that FDA is going to want. They're going to want to see your records. If you got a pest management program and you have standard operating procedures for that pest management program, they want to see that you actually have records, that you followed that protocol, that you yourself have established for your facility. Take a look at those apples up there in that top right corner picture. I see 4 of them that have been chewed on. I don't know if any of the others have been chewed on or not, but I really don't want any of the apples that are right next to the ones that have been chewed on. So pest management is very important. You probably don't want to buy those apples either if you saw a picture like that coming from the packing house. So pest management is important. Make sure you maintain a good program, monitor regularly to make sure it's not a problem, and make sure your employees report any pest problems they see. The last thing you want is a situation like the old movie, The Green Mile, where you have these prisoners and they've made a pet out of a mouse. You don't want an employee that thinks it's cute to see that little mouse in the corner eating a piece of your fruit or your vegetable. You want to make sure that they know that's a problem and we cannot have it. Under the new FSMA rules, you cannot have that problem. If they see it, they are supposed to report it. So be sure that program that you put in place for pest control is doing its job of controlling the pests that you have. Now, cold storage. You may not have cold storage. It may not be an issue for you. It may not be an issue for any of the growers who you work with. But if you do have cold storage, it's a big problem area for a few reasons. One of the big ones is condensation. Once I get this cool air next to some warm, moist air, I'm going to end up with condensation, and that results in problems for me from a food safety standpoint. For example, if I've got strawberries, I don't ever want to have any condensation touch that strawberry, because once that strawberry is wet, it starts degrading. The quality goes down immediately. So I don't want condensation problems, and I want to inspect my coolers to make sure that I don't have a condensation problem. A big part of that's going to make sure that any seals I have around the doors to the coolers, or typically don't have a lot of windows for coolers, but if you do, make sure you don't have a leaking window seal. You also want to make sure those temperatures are monitored. And this is from a quality control standpoint. And you will see in some of the good ag practices protocols and documents that you can get from a lot of the land grant universities, they will have desirable cooler temperatures for different types of produce. So if you have multiple types of produce, make sure that your coolers are the temperature, at least in those coolers, are set for what is appropriate for the produce that you have. And even coolers can have pest problems. Just because it's a little cool doesn't mean that a rodent won't try to get in there and find a snack or a place to hang out. So coolers can be a problem. You want to make sure that you keep them clean. I mentioned earlier the Bluebell ice cream example. I talked to an inspector who was at one of the Bluebell plants, and he says the problem was the coolers. It's not like they were doing anything wrong, but those coolers had biofilm build up in them. So even when they were cleaning, Listeria likes a nice cool environment. It doesn't care. So Listeria was thriving under that biofilm. They didn't clean their coolers properly. And once you start scraping away that biofilm, you're really releasing the pathogens that have been thriving underneath that biofilm. So keep your coolers clean and avoid condensation. Ice and ice slurries, a lot of people don't think about this. They think it's ice, it's frozen, how much of a problem can it be? But just think about any inspector that goes into a restaurant, or for that matter, any inspector that goes into a food processing establishment. The ice machines are always on the list to be checked. And you will have food processors and restaurants get written up regularly because they don't do a good job of cleaning their ice makers or their ice distribution systems. They end up with slime in the ice machine, and that becomes a big problem. They get written up for it. And under the new FSMA rules, anyone that uses ice in their packing process or their storage process on the farm also needs to be aware that that can be a problem. And if for some reason an inspector comes to your farm because there's been an incident, or just because they're making a periodic inspection, this is going to be one of the areas where they'll check. So you want to make sure that your equipment, that your ice equipment is clean, that anything that you store ice in is clean. You don't want to stack boxes containing iced produce above other boxes. That's dripping. That's just a cross-contamination risk. If there's a problem in the crate on the top, then that melting ice has just transferred that problem to every crate underneath. Transportation considerations, if you know, many of you, if you're like me, you have one pickup, and that pickup does everything. So it may be the same pickup that you carried composted manure, and that becomes the same pickup you're using to carry produce to the farmer's market or to a wholesaler for distribution through the food chain. So you got to think about what are you doing to keep that clean. And I know that going back to my example Saturday, my poop covered boots went into the back of my pickup. If you saw me the next day with produce at a farmer's market, you might be kind of wondering how well I cleaned out the bed of that pickup. So that's something to keep in mind. Some farms may use vehicles for many farming purposes. You may even have the dog riding in the back of the truck right up to the point where you put the produce in. So can you keep that pickup bed clean? Or if nothing else, just get some plastic liners that you might use if you were painting on the inside of your house. Put one of those plastic liners down over the pickup bed before you stack the produce that you're going to deliver. Now, if it's not an open truck, if we're talking about a truck that is enclosed and has refrigeration, condensation becomes an issue there. Is your refrigeration unit creating a condensation problem inside your truck? So make sure the trucks are clean, free from any physical debris, any off odors, because those off odors will transfer to your produce, and that could create a problem for you down the road in your marketability of your produce. And if you hire transportation, make sure they do their job and make it part of the contract requirements that they clean, sanitize their equipment. And once again, if it's not written down, it didn't happen. So if someone is delivering that produce for you and they say, yes, we clean and sanitize our trucks, make sure they can show you the documentation. The refrigeration is a big concern. You need to make sure that those refrigeration units are functioning properly, that they're at the proper temperature. And in refrigeration, the problems may not be just with the coils and condensers of the refrigeration unit. I've got a great example of someone this summer whose granddaughter was helping with the business. So she was driving the truck. It was a big converted van that was cold storage, and they were doing deliveries out of that. And they had a generator that they had built in. It fed off the same gas tank as the truck, but that generator was hidden underneath the big conversion van, and it powered the cooler. Well, she never checked the generator, ran it low on oil, burned up the generator. Now all of a sudden there's no refrigeration, and that truck it's sitting on the side of the road because they can't deliver any more produce in it, trying to transfer the produce before it gets too hot in the back to another vehicle to deliver it. And they're out a few days before they can use that truck again. So if refrigeration is required, make sure the refrigeration units are functioning properly, and everything that keeps those refrigeration units running is functioning properly. Standard operating procedures, SOPs can be found. You can find all sorts of examples for cleaning and sanitation practices. Some of them you can find that may be exactly what you need for your farm, your operation. Others you may look at and go, that's pretty close and I can modify it. And most of them that you can receive from any of the land grant universities. I know Cornell has created a whole series of SOPs that are tied to their good ag practices literature that can be downloaded and have been shared by folks all across the country. Those can be modified, and the IFAI has several of these that they provide as examples to those that participate in the FSMA produce safety rule trainings. And they can modify those to fit their needs. So you can have them for pest control, cleaning and sanitizing. You can have SOPs for training your employees about everything that we see on this bulleted list here. Monitoring the cold storage areas, inspecting the trucks, cleaning the vehicles. The big key to remember here is for one up that you're not going to follow. Don't write one up that says, I'm going to check for pests every 30 minutes. Because if it doesn't happen, then you just violated your own operating procedures. And your records will have to show that you didn't do what you said you would do. And if, heaven forbid, you ever have an FDA inspector at your farm because there's been an incident, the last thing you want to see, last thing you want to do is have to show them your SOPs and records that say, I didn't do what my SOPs said I would do. We focus mainly on microbial risks because those are the big ones. Those are the ones we typically think of when we think of food safety concerns, but they're not the only ones. And granted, between the microorganisms and viruses that may be a concern, we still have chemical risks and even physical risks, things that could physically end up in the fruits and vegetables. The chemical risk can come from pesticides, detergents, sanitizers, any other chemicals that may be used in or near the facility. So even think of a neighboring farmer they may be spraying for green bugs, and it's drifting over into your packing shed. That could become a problem for you. In the grain industry, the use of pesticides has become such an issue that in grain elevators, you're very limited. I mean, you're down to just one or two options for what you can do to control pests, because most of the other have concerns. They may be reactive materials. They may leach into the food product. So it becomes an issue. So if you want to reduce those chemical food safety risks, keep all the chemicals locked and stored in an area away from the packing and storage areas. You may even have an SOP just for that, and train your workers on how to follow those rules. Once again, I'm an economist, but I work in a food processing facility. Part of this facility is inspected by USDA. Part of it's inspected by FDA, all the non-meats areas, FDA inspection. Because my office is in this building, I have to go through a HAZCOM training at least once a year. It's required. So I have to learn all about all the hazardous materials that may be in my facility. I have to know all the SOPs for handling those. I have to know how to store them, where to store them, how to make sure they're properly labeled. I have to be aware of the SDS, the safety data sheets for these different chemicals, who has copies of those in case we do have an incident. If I spill something on myself, what is my concern there? What is the environmental and physical concern to me of coming in contact with any of these chemicals? And if I do get it on my hands or in my eyes, what can I do to get rid of it? How should I treat it? So those SDS sheets are there in case of an emergency. I'm always surprised that people that don't know in food processing, you have to use food grade lubricants, oils, and chemicals. I don't go out to the garage where I grease my truck and grab the grease gun and bearings on my packing shed conveyor belts. It's food grade. And once again, this food grade issue is really part of the good manufacturing practices that FDA has had in place for food processors for years. But now we're seeing these being requirements of FSMA rules themselves. Use non-reactive materials that won't leach in a produce or become a problem. I'll give you a good example. I know a USDA inspected meat processor in the state of Oklahoma. The facility was bought out, it changed hands, the new owner came in, and the first thing he did was go around this plant, which had been sitting idle. He went around the inside and sprayed a pesticide all around the inside of the packing shed, even in the coolers, before he turned everything back on. His USDA inspector came in and saw what he was doing and said, "You're using something that has not been approved for use in a food processing establishment. We're pulling your certificate of inspection. You can't do any meat processing in here until you go through and thoroughly clean out this entire facility to a degree that we approve of. Then you can come back and start up business." And it's all because didn't pay attention to what could and should be used in a food processing area. So the chemical food safety risks are real. We don't think of them as much as we do with the pathogens, but they are real. Same with physical food safety risk. When we start talking about wood, metal, glass, plastic, foreign objects, we're really talking about the same things that a food inspector would be looking for in a food processing facility. And if you don't think those can be a problem, think about the lights in your packing shed on your farm. What kind of lights do you have? Do you have an enclosed bulb so that if you get a power surge or a bird flies in and hits a light, if that light bulb shatters, what happens to all those shards of glass? Where do they go? So think about that from the standpoint of your lights. Think about all the moving parts on your equipment that may introduce pieces of metal or pieces of plastic into your produce. Nobody wants to bite into that in a bag of fresh baby spinach. So think about all those issues, those packing materials, produce container pieces, anything that could become a physical food safety risk in that fresh product once it reaches the consumer. And as with anything, corrective actions. We can talk about what you should look out for. We can talk about ways you can try to prevent things that can happen. But once again, Murphy's Law. If it can happen, it will happen. If you don't believe me, think of all those people along the Gulf Coast that are having to recover from Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Irma. You don't think there have been some issues in their packing facilities or in their food sanitation protocols when when their packing shed was sitting under a foot of water, or the power went out for a week, and now all of a sudden you may have mold and mildew growth taking place, or standing water resulting from condensation or spoiled produce. Whatever it may be, if a food safety risk is identified, make sure that you have some corrective action for it. What is the real problem? What all has been affected? Has it compromised my fruits and vegetables? Does this mean that I can no longer sell them fresh because they've been compromised? I need to look at the processor's market as an outlet to sell this produce, or is it so far gone I can't even do that? Is this problem, am I dealing with a symptom, or have I identified the real cause of the problem, and have I taken the appropriate steps to correct it? And once again, I got to have records, because if I don't write it down, it didn't happen. Now, corrective actions could come in a number of forms. That may be a pest issue. One thing that most people don't think about, and I think back to my dad. My dad says, we really haven't done a work project around the farm unless somebody's bleeding. Well, I don't want anybody bleeding in the packing shed, but you have two kinds of people that they have different reactions when they get cut. One person will calmly grab that finger, wrap it up with something, and go treat the wound. The other person will panic, flail about, and throw blood everywhere. So if someone does that, one of your employees did that in your packing shed, what's the level of contamination that occurred? How far was that blood thrown? Has it created a problem for a few cases of produce, or is it something where you got to really stop the line and go through and clean up a conveyor belt? Drains in food processing, this is one of the problems that everyone hates, but almost everyone has experienced at one time or another. You usually think water only goes one way, down the drain. Unfortunately, sometimes stuff backs up. And if you don't clean out your drain traps, or you have a flood scenario that impacts your operation or near your farm, you may see some backup into that handling area. And that may create all sorts of both physical, chemical, and pathogenic risks in your facilities. As always, record keeping. And that's key to everything in the food industry these days, record keeping. The IFAI has worked with many other institutions and collected several different examples of record keeping documents and forms that may be useful to you, but it's important to keep all these records. You have to have records for how you've cleaned and sanitized your tool, equipment, and containers. You may need records for all these other things, pest management, building maintenance, that you've occasionally, or at least once a year, provide some training to your workers on sanitation, that your coolers and cold storage areas are being cleaned, that the temperature is being monitored, that the vehicle is being appropriately maintained. All those are very important. So in summary, no matter what kind of packing area you have, whether it's the big, beautiful Cadillac or whether it's the little Yugo, they all have sanitation practices that have to be maintained to minimize contamination risk from pathogens, chemicals, and then the physical advance of materials that may come in contact with the product. The food contact surfaces, remember zone 1. Everything's important. Zone 1, 2, 3, and 4 are all important, but zone 1 is the key. And also remember, cleaning and sanitizing are definitely not the same thing. You cannot sanitize a dirty surface. And all these food safety practices need to be in place if you're going to reduce those risks. And it's not just a recommendation. This is part of the new FSMA produce safety rule. And thank you for that. And we'll see whatever questions we may have come in. Brian, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Holcomb. That was a fantastic presentation. I'm going to give you a couple of bonus points because you mentioned a Yugo. And I don't think any of us have thought about that in about 20 years. So kudos to you. All right. So while everyone is formulating whatever question they might have for Dr. Holcomb, I'll just remind everyone that once this presentation is over, this video will be posted to the webpage that you see on your screen there. And there are many, many more materials on our website at indigenousfoodandag.com/food safety. I encourage everyone to go there to see where our in-person regional trainings are, the remaining webinars that are in this series, and like I just mentioned, you can see all the videos from our past webinars, and there's also links to a lot of other food safety resources. So I very much encourage you to visit that website. And it looks like we have a question. The question is, do you have a checklist for the different components you discussed, considerations to monitor?
I do not have a standardized checklist, and once again, this goes back to the fact that every farm is different. Some of the things that I'm going to deal with if I'm doing melons or cucurbits is going to be very different than what I would deal with if I have strawberries, raspberries, or fresh greens. There are several examples out there. Cornell University has made a huge list of these. The Produce Safety Alliance has created a website where you can locate and download some of these that may be useful to you. And the Indigenous Food and Ag Initiative has a whole, they give away thumb drives at trainings that will have some of these example checklists that you may need. So there's not a standardized one, but you can find some pretty good examples with just a little bit of looking.
Alrighty, we do have another question that came through. This is actually a two-part question. What are your thoughts on a product called Sanidate for vegetable cleaning from the field? Is there a source for information on what produce should and shouldn't be processed? For example, we use a product called Sanidate, and some things shouldn't stay in the solution very long.
Okay, I have to be honest. I don't know enough about Sanidate to give an informed response here. I work with some food microbiologists that have used several different sanitizing agents, even some that are approved for organic produce washing. I might be able to get more information on the product from them. There are some of the ones that have been proposed. I know I've visited with a couple of dealers, and they've generally been inclined to tell me what the difference is between one sanitizer and another. What's the impact on the produce? I know that a lot of these sanitizers you will see, it doesn't take very long to degrade the product. I know that some of the ones that are out there right now, especially if you're using like a hydrogen peroxide solution in your organic processor doing fresh greens, it doesn't take much, and that sanitizing step will turn your greens a little brown. I would recommend checking with the safety data sheets on Sanidate and see what it says, and you may be able to just do a Google search and find where somebody has done some comparisons with Sanidate and a few other options, just to see how they compare in terms of their ability to handle pathogen control, and if anyone's noticed any differences in the produce itself.
Okay, thank you. Last call for questions. I'm not seeing any more questions, so we'll go ahead and wrap up today's webinar. Once again, I would like to thank our presenter, Dr. Rodney Holcomb. It was a fantastic presentation. Please visit our website at indigenousfoodandag.com/food safety. If you want to refer to this presentation at a later time, the video will be posted. And also, you can download the slides themselves if you just want to have those for reference later on. So we'll go ahead and wrap up today's presentation, and thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you, Brian.